Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. On behalf of IISD, IFPRI, and Cornell University, I would like to welcome you all today to our virtual meeting on COVID-19 and the global food security implications. Thank you for participating in such big numbers. My name is Karen Smaller, and I'm the Director for Agriculture, Trade and Investment at IISD. We're part of a joint project called Series 2030, a 3-year research initiative to support international efforts to end hunger sustainably and identify the role donors can play to support this effort. This work becomes even more relevant in light of the economic crisis that is unfolding. We meet at a strange and difficult time for the world. While we wait for others to join, I'm going to say a few words. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do a round of introductions. We've had an overwhelming response to this meeting with over 500 people registered. So here are a few rules of the game. Next slide. We will be hosting a Q&A session. Clearly, there is a lot of appetite for this kind of conversation, and we will be trying to find ways in the future to host other and similar conversations. So please send your questions in writing throughout the discussion using the options that are currently described on the screen. We may not be able to get to all your questions, but we will keep a record of them and follow up with you. If anyone needs technical assistance, please contact my colleague, Sophia Belino, who's named in the chat as technical support. This is a 1-hour meeting. We aim to keep roughly half of our time for the discussion and the other half for questions and answers. We may go over 15 minutes in order to be able to answer more of your questions. Next slide. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrown the world into a very sharp shock. But the food system was already struggling. Just over 10 years ago, global food security suffered a huge shock with the 2008-2009 food price crisis, followed by the financial crisis and a global recession. At the same time, the effects of climate change continue to disrupt the food system. All of this has led to a steady rise in hunger over the past 3 years after decades of progress. According to FAO's State of Food Security and Nutrition, last year's economic slowdown was one of the main reasons that hunger rose by a further 20 million people. Hunger rose not because there was a shortage of food, but because people did not have enough money to buy the food they needed. As we know, one of the most common responses to COVID-19 has been a shutdown of the economy, followed by massive job losses. This loss of income for billions of people could be the most devastating effect of the COVID-19 crisis. In a letter to the Financial Times last week, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, recognized this and called for a response that is global in design and application, guided by a sense of global solidarity. I hope this discussion will contribute to a better understanding of the food security implications from COVID-19, but more importantly, how we can act together to respond to the economic and social crises from this pandemic. Next slide. I'm honored to have with me a distinguished panel of experts and government officials who have written about the food security implications of COVID-19 and are responding on the ground. Professor Jennifer Clapp is professor at the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She is a member of the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts to the UN Committee on World Food Security and the Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability. She is an expert on global governance at the intersection of the economy, food security, and the environment. Dr. David Laborde de Buquet is a senior research fellow in the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division and theme leader on macroeconomics and trade at IFPRI. His work is focused on globalization, international trade, and the measurement and modeling of economic, social, and environmental issues. Dr. Issa Barrow is our discussant and advisor to the Minister of Agriculture of Senegal. He's in charge of international cooperations and partnerships and previously worked at the UN, the International Finance Corporation, and the African Development Bank. His specialty is in inclusive finance and access to finance for small and medium enterprises. And last but not least, we have Honorable Christophe Bazivamo, the Deputy Secretary General of the East African Community and in charge of coordinating their response to the pandemic. He was previously a member of the East African Legislative Assembly and before that held various ministerial posts in Rwanda, including as the Minister for Lands, Environment, Forestry, Water and Mines, and as the Minister for Agriculture and Animal Resources, among others. Honorable Bazivamo has reminded me that today is the 26th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. So I'd like to briefly hand over to him to lead us in a minute of silence.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It is true at EAC level, we have been commemorating today the 26th anniversary of the genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, as it has been done the same way at the UN level, United States, and also African Union level, and of course in Rwanda. So in 1994, we have lost more than 1 million people, and every year we have this kind of commemoration. And I wish we take 1 minute silence to remember all lost lives during that genocide. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Honorable Bazivamo. So let's start with our discussion. So, the question on everyone's lips. First, to you, David. What do you think is the most serious threat of COVID-19 for global food security? And what is the likely food security impact of this crisis?
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Yes, Karen, I think you asked the key question, and my answer will be straightforward right now is this economic recession and the loss of income we see across countries and across households. People need money to buy food, and actually, for a large share of the population and the poorest population on Earth, it's daily income that allows them to buy daily food for them and their family. And compared to a previous crises where we had a lack of food or a restriction on the food supply or food price going up, in the current situation right now, it's the confinement measures, and they are needed, we are not questioning their relevance, that actually leads to an economic system that gets frozen and people doesn't have the income that they will need to buy food. And I will say, compared to a past crisis, or like the food price crisis you were referring to, when prices go up, of course, it's bad for consumer, but it's good for producers. So you will see winners and losers. In this case, we are all losers, okay? We have an economic recession, everyone is losing, farmers and consumers. Now, what we have to be also very clear about is we are not all equal facing this loss of income. The panelists here can continue to work, can continue to have income. For most of the unskilled workers of the world, most of the poor people, the fact that they are locked in their house and in some cases in very bad condition, cut this income. So really that's a kind of big difference, and I want to emphasize it. On the slide right now, you will see some quantitative assessment we have done already now, nearly 1 month ago, when we were just maybe looking at the 1% reduction in economic growth. So it was relatively optimistic compared to where we are now in terms of projection. And we already see a significant impact in increasing poverty by 40 million people. So now we are talking about a global crisis that can be 2, 3, 4, 5 times of this. And the second point I will make about this economic crisis compared to the previous one that was triggered by the financial crisis that basically was originated in the developed economy and contaminated the rest of the world, but didn't really hurt the daily life of smallholders or small farmers or poor people in the developing world. Here we are talking about an economic crisis that will manifest itself in every country. We are disrupting the economic system in every country. So this is why, to some extent, we have to go back more to what has happened in 1929, that what has happened just a few decades ago. So this is where we really need to make sure that we have social safety net adapted to all situations that can trigger this. Now, just to, I don't want to say that there is no problem in the food system itself. Yes, we have enough food, but we see disruption in some sectors. We see disruption in specific value chain and supply line. But really, the main issue right now is income. And I will conclude by saying the next threat is panic. So information is needed to avoid policymakers to panic, because bad decisions make things worse, to avoid households to panic, and more or less to avoid any hoarding behavior at the country level or at the household level. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Jennifer, to you. The report from the high-level panel of experts clearly says that loss of income is one of the threats, but it also mentions a whole lot of others. So what do you think are some of the other threats to food security from COVID?
And thank you for putting up my slide. I would like to say that there are a range of issues that are connected to the COVID-19 crisis that are affecting food security, and they're interconnected in complex ways. And I think it's important to understand that complexity, but also the way in which those risks are going to likely shift and change over time. So I don't want to repeat what David just said about the importance of access and the economic recession, which is super important, but some of the other factors I'd like to highlight. And if we think of the immediate term, like what's going on right now and in the coming weeks, we are seeing disruptions to food supply chains that are affecting availability. And they're affecting consumers and producers in different kinds of ways. We're seeing panic buying in food outlets, for example, where some people with more economic means are buying up and stockpiling even in their own homes, which is leaving less food available for others who don't have as many means to do the same. And producers are also being affected, and this is quite difficult because the disruption in the supply chains means that in many instances, especially for fresh foods like dairy and fruits and vegetables, they're not able to get to the marketplace. And we're seeing lots of reports of farmers allowing crops to simply rot in the field or dumping milk. So these are real disruptions that are affecting availability. So that's layered on top of the kind of things that David mentioned, the job losses and income constraints that are resulting from the recession. And we also have to think about the closure of schools. Something around 85 to 90% of schools around the world are closing because of the crisis. And this means a loss of school meals for many millions of children who really need and depend on those meals. And also there's a lower availability now of fresh fruits and vegetables because of those supply chain disruptions that I mentioned, which is affecting people's nutrition at the moment. And this is really important point because undernourishment and other kinds of malnutrition are actually making people more at risk of being susceptible to the COVID-19 disease. And so that's a real important concern. And these things are all going on in the immediate term. But if we need to think also about the medium and the longer term. So in the medium term, in the coming months, we're already hearing farmers talking about constraints to labor. They're worried about whether their farm labor will travel to farms. And they're also finding it difficult in some instances to secure inputs for the growing season. And for example, we've heard reports of shortages of fertilizer in certain parts of China, for example, or shortages of animal feed and the culling of a huge amount of poultry, for example, in China as a result of the inability to get feed. And also concerns I've read about in Canada here about farmers worrying about whether they'll be able to get the seed they need for the growing season. So there are huge concerns around inputs, which could certainly affect production. And then there are those risks that David mentioned that countries, we're already seeing reports, they're beginning to stockpile grain or impose export restrictions, which could affect prices. And that could be very problematic in the face of the global recession where many people are being pushed into extreme poverty. And these kind of dynamics really are risky for the world's food import dependent countries. But then as we look, even into the longer term, even if we can iron out some of those production and supply chain constraints, the global recession is, as David mentioned, very important for understanding the longer term impact. Some estimates are saying this recession is going to last quite some time, perhaps even until the end of late 2021. There's a bit of debate about that, whether it'll be a U-shaped or a V-shaped recession. But this is having an impact. This will have an impact over the longer term, especially as people exhaust their immediate coping mechanisms or sell off their assets. They're going to have to shift their diets to more affordable foods, which often are less nutritious. And again, this will affect those countries that rely on global imports quite significantly, especially for countries that are commodity export dependent. So, sorry, I talked a little bit long there, but it's a very complicated situation and it's shifting over time. And one thing important to remember, to pick up on one thing David mentioned, which is inequality. And I would say that throughout this immediate, medium, and longer term, what we're seeing is inequality becoming more pronounced over time. And this is very, very dangerous for the question of food security, because as was mentioned already, over 820 million people don't have enough access to sufficient food, and this could get much worse as inequality is exacerbated.
Thanks, Jennifer. Honourable Bazivamo, you're coordinating the response for the East African community. Can you share with us from your perspective what you feel the most serious threats are now and how high up on the agenda food security is?
So thank you, Karin. Actually, for most serious concern, and the first one we have at this time around, is the spread of pandemic. Measures are being taken to stop the spread. And you see closure of schools, markets, even airports, you closure of borders here and there. And we have stopped all meetings throughout the region. And this is a decision taken at the East African community level by all ministers in charge of Ministry of Health and ministers in charge of East African Community Affairs. But this has also other impacts. And the second biggest problem now is the free movement of goods, because we cater to stop the spread of the pandemic, but at the same time, you need transport, you need trade, you need actually trucks to move throughout the region. And if it is not controlled well, then it brings another problem of food insecurity in the region, especially as we know that for intra-trade here in East Africa, 65% is about food commodities. If there is no movement, or movements are not facilitated, then it becomes a big problem, especially on food security. We have a challenge, especially immediate one. You have people who are having money every day because of what they have done. These are daily workers, manpowers who get money every day and can buy what they can eat. This is no more possible. These people are stuck at home because of the confinement measures. And for that reason, these people, in addition to other people who are poor, are not having what to eat at the time being. So the state has to come into to see how to distribute food here and there. And this is really also challenging. Outside that, when you consider the whole system in agriculture and food security in general, you see it at the second end or at around 80, between 70. It means then our industries are facing problems of production. One side being people working in industries, the other side raw material. This is not well operational. And on the production side, you have also problems when it comes to trade of seeds, trade of fertilizers, and this is the hindrance. And the further area is the trade then, because these are interrelated: production, agro-industry, and trade. If you have no free movement of people, you have no free movement of goods, this becomes a big challenge in the region. We are trying to handle it, but it is not easy. So to say, these are actually the main challenges we are facing now: problems of maintaining the whole system working, production, while you have no people working here and there, agro-industry, agro-processing, when you do not have enough raw material, and this will, of course, bring the issue of post-harvest losses. We were normally at around 30% of the production being lost because of poor post-harvest handling. If you add COVID-19, then this will be worse. Whatever is produced, if agro-industry is not working well, we shall face more losses. But we are trying to see how to manage the situation, but it is not easy.
Thank you.
And this is coming in addition to the desert locusts we have been facing, which are destroying our agriculture products, especially in Kenya, Uganda, and some part of Tanzania. And this has been also another challenge. When you add two big problems, at the end you foresee the region will be suffering, of course, with this kind of problems on food security.
Thank you, Honourable Bazivamo. Jennifer, is this like other crises we've seen before? And if so, what can we learn from them?
Thanks, Karen. It's a great question, because on the surface, it might appear that it's similar, for example, to the 2008 food crisis, where we're seeing consumers panic buying, we're seeing countries stockpiling, we're seeing some countries imposing export restrictions, and those are familiar kinds of actions in the face of a crisis. But I would say that this particular crisis, the underlying dynamics are fundamentally different. And I'll just talk, there are lots of ways in which it's different. I'll just talk about a couple of those. And if you want to put that slide back up, that's fine. First, I just want to say that the current crisis unlike 2008, was not triggered by, you know, concerns about the global food supply, where we saw, you know, traders and commodity speculators concerned about what we call the stock to use ratio, where it's the amount of stocks in storage compared, you know, as a ratio of what's utilized. And at the present time, we're actually, grain production globally is quite healthy. We're seeing high and record levels of production. Stock to use ratios are around 30% right now, and during the 2008 crisis, it was closer to 20. So it was a much more dire, you know, situation that really had people concerned in 2008 with respect to the global food supply. Whereas today, at least grain stocks at the moment are quite healthy. As I said already, there could be some production disruptions, but often those are forecast to be more in the fresh fruits and vegetables kinds of crops. And so the crisis is different. This is a crisis of supply chains. This is a crisis that is, in a way, it is because we're having to put policies into place by prioritizing public health and stopping the spread of this disease. Because if we let it go, it will also affect supply chains in important ways. And so it's, in a way, triggered by that kind of supply chain disruption. So it's quite different in that sense. And another way in which it's quite different is that because of that situation in terms of food supply, we're not seeing commodity prices going very high and volatile like we did in 2008. And at that time, we saw, quite interestingly, the prices were really tracking of commodities, where all commodities were rising, oil and minerals and food at the same time. This time we're seeing declining commodity prices. And even though some commodity prices like energy are really dropping through the floor, metals and minerals are also falling. Food prices are maybe a bit more stable, but I think the last food price index was indicating a slight drop. This could all change as well. We should be aware of that, especially if countries put in place export restrictions and that sort of thing. But it's interesting, and in particular, I put up the commodity price index information there. This is from the World Bank, which was published on their website last week, showing that food commodity prices vis-a-vis these other commodity prices, they are a bit more buoyant. And this can be a real problem, especially for countries that rely on commodity exports for their foreign exchange and then buy food on world markets, because what we're seeing then is that their income is likely to fall, their exchange rates are likely to depreciate in the face of falling commodity prices, while their food prices for imports might remain the same or might even go up. But even there within food, which is why I put up the graphic showing the impact on commodity future prices for different food items or agricultural items, it's different even for all different commodities. Wheat is probably, is doing well compared to some of these other crops because of the ability to get these foods to market. And as the crisis takes hold, we're going to see demand falling for certain kinds of food, and that could lead to lower commodity prices. So the crisis feels very different to me as someone who spent a lot of time studying the 2008 food crisis. It's not that kind of like panic about supply. It's more about disruptions to supply chains. But I do think, just briefly, there are some lessons that we can still learn.
I may ask you to give us those lessons after, Jennifer.
Sure.
David, do you agree with Jennifer's sentiments? What are the lessons you're learning? You've been writing a lot about trade policies. Is this crisis similar to past crises? What do we know about the types of trade policies we should or shouldn't be putting in place?
So what we are seeing right now is some similar behavior than we have seen in the past, meaning that when people panic and when policymakers panic, they want to focus first of all on their community and constituency, and we try to close the border to protect their population versus others. And when they export food, they want to keep food at home just in case you need it. And that's actually starting to create panic and tension. Now, the good news is that compared to 10 years ago, the share and the number of countries that are adopting this behavior is much more limited. So we are not talking about right now 1% of the global trade of food product that is actually under such restriction. The biggest one may be the export restriction on rice done by Vietnam, that is about 10% of the world market, and that takes place in a situation where actually Thailand has some supply constraint coming from a drought, but overall the market are still well supplied. Large countries like India and China have large domestic stock. So one important question will be, in case of the market panicking, we will need the big country to take responsibility to stabilize the markets and use their stocks not only for themselves, but for their region. And really, I think that we need solidarity in actions. Now, in terms of export restriction, we track them on a policy tracker we have at IFPRI, and every day there is a few things moving. The main risk we see here is the imitation game. So when you see Kazakhstan or Russia doing something, the next day you will see the authority in Moldova saying, oh, if they are doing it, we need to do it. And what we don't want is this domino effect. We don't want it in Central Asia. We don't want it around the Black Sea, that is actually a big supplier of grains for the world. But also we see it even across the African continent and within REX. And I think it's where what is happening in regional entities is very important to try to get this regional solidarity beyond global solidarity. We need global, regional solidarity and cooperation. And unfortunately, we see even within West Africa, some countries closing their, or formally or informally, blocking their export to their neighbor. And I will just say that we need trade and we need open trade. The dream that, oh, because we have a crisis, we cannot rely on foreign markets. The situation with the locust in East Africa is a perfect example. You will not close your border to the locust. You will need to import food if you cannot produce it, because things happen. Bad things happen every day, everywhere. So when you are happy to import some food because you have to deal with a locust pandemic, you need someone to be ready to export this food. So you need markets, you need fair markets, and you need to make sure that the logistics and the policy are aligned. And I think maybe just to finish, compared to last time, at least among the big players, and learning from last time and same initiative like called AMIS, that is about providing information to market and policymakers. Among the G20 countries, we have seen some restraint, at least on the food markets. That actually is not the situation at all in terms of pharmaceutical and medical equipment, where here we see basically everyone putting export restriction, and that is very, very dangerous. But right now on food market, we see a bit more restraint, but let's be careful about contagion and think that when we face a crisis, solidarity and exchanging goods and ideas is one of the best safety net we have.
Thanks, David. Honourable Bazivamo, what is the EAC learning about what is needed to better deal with not only the COVID crisis, but other crises today and in the future?
Working together, discussing all these things, we have found solutions which can actually play for everyone and solve solutions, give solutions. The issue of trade is normally not to be discussed. We say it is not negotiable. We should be allowing trade moving throughout the region, and the ministers have accepted that. They are trying to remove all non-tariff barriers to ensure there is free movement of goods in the of problem, to bring people together so that we find a common solution for the problems people are facing. The other thing you have noticed is we need to have strong structure and strong policies, especially when it comes to deal with emergency. We have seen actually the response are not well implemented. These emergency plans are not well implemented, and you have to strengthen the structures to ensure this is happening. And we have found it is also very important that each and every country, not only at national level, but also at not only at national level, but also at regional level, we should be having what we can call disaster risk emergency response plan and different funds, so that at a certain period when you have this kind of problem, people can work together and use what we have agreed upon so that we can handle the situation together. Lastly, I wish to say that it is important that the health system has to be strengthened. This is also something which is needed, but also open at regional level so that whenever a country is facing problems, solutions can be found in a region in a facilitated way. And lastly, local production. For essential goods, essential products like sanitizers, like these gloves, like even this face mask, these things which are essential, like essential goods or food, should be, whenever it is possible and wherever it is possible, actually produced locally to ensure sustainability. And here we have actually seen that promoting local production, especially local agro industries, is the key in this kind of situation. It has helped somehow to think about it and then to maybe later on in the future to move in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to hear about your thoughts about looking forward and what we should be anticipating in the coming weeks and months. But before I do that, I would like to, we've got quite a lot of questions coming in. So I'd like to start by giving Dr. Issa Barrow from the Ministry of Agriculture in Senegal a chance to share with us his thoughts about what he's heard today from our panelists, and whether this echoes the experience that's happening in Senegal now and how the ministry is responding. And then I will take some questions. Okay, I think he may be having some technical challenges. The connection in Senegal is not so great. I would also like to, I have noticed that we have on the call today both the chief economist of FAO, Maximo Torero, and the newly appointed special rapporteur on the right to food, Michael IFPRI. So apologies for putting you both on the spot right now, but I wonder if either of you would like to share your own reflections, comment on what the panelists have said before I pass to some of the questions that have come in through the chat. And please feel free to tell me you'd rather not take the floor. But if we can maybe first, Michael IFPRI, who's newly appointed Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, did you want to make any comments to the group?
Thank you. So thank you, everyone. This is incredibly interesting. So a lot of the perspectives have been focusing on different policy approaches and highlighting just understanding and gathering data. And I'm thinking more in the medium term, but also in the past. So this is just my question that maybe we can think about, or for the panelists. So ever since the 2008 food crisis, we've seen the international trade architecture really has proven to some degree inadequate with dealing with food security. So in fact, the issue of food security, poverty, agriculture has been central to debates about the WTO since 1994, since its inception. So in many ways, this pandemic, there are a lot of new issues that are arising, and Jennifer Clapp highlighted those quite nicely, I think. But it's accelerating and exacerbating already existing problems. So the question I'm thinking about into the future is, what's the appropriate forum for these discussions about food security and trade? So the problem is just as much ecological as it is economic, as we're understanding how the virus arose, about not just this virus, but other viruses and other pandemics have often been because of ecological issues. And it's not clear to me that the WTO is the adequate forum to discuss food security and international trade. So should we be thinking about other forums to discuss these things? Should we be talking about fundamental reforms? So I just want to bring in the institutional perspective into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was certainly echoes a few other questions we've received in the chat. Another question we've received from Rued Ruben at Wageningen University is more about what's the scale of resources needed and how much will this response cost? What should we spend that money on? And how can we determine the best interventions? The third question from Helen Ding is, will the scale of food systems shift to a smaller scale, more local and regional, less global? And if so, with what risks and consequences? The fourth question we have is, what are the fundamental economic shifts that are needed for the questions? Is it time to stop taxing labor, for example? Should we focus on income redistribution and less on income growth? Can we build more direct and safe distribution channels since farmers' markets are closed, although supermarkets are open? And then a sixth question, before I come back to the panelists to hear their response, is how can we ensure that food security policy advice is differentiated and geared to country context, taking account of the very different risks, vulnerable populations, fiscal possibilities, etc., in the global south? And this was a question from Shefali Sharma at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Honorable Bazivamo, shall I let you give our first response?
So thank you, Karin. What I wish to highlight is answering some of the questions from Wageningen is that we should be trying our best as partner state here and there to facilitate the trade, because production and industries can only be there if trade is operational. You cannot produce without selling. By trade, you promote also market, and then by trading, you promote production. This is one. But the second part is we should do whatever possible to support wherever possible farmers to continue producing and helping them to market their products and reduce post-harvest losses. For me, these are key. If we want to cater for food security, trade is an element which is very fundamental because it helps agro-industry to work and also then to ensure our farmers are producing. And here the issue of agriculture input like fertilizers and seeds has to be seen, but it is important also not to speak about availing these fertilizers and seeds, but also to make them accessible for farmers so that they can use them. So these are the key elements I wanted to point out, not only in this situation, but also in the future, because if we don't think about it now, it will be late in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, did you want to respond to some of the questions?
Sure, thank you. Those are all excellent questions, and I'll try to be brief. I mean, just on the, I expect David would like to answer the trade and WTO question, but I would like to say that I think that the Committee on World Food Security is a potential place where we could have more of those discussions on the role of trade and economics affecting food security. And I know that often when economic issues come up, we often hear, oh, that gets discussed in the WTO, but if the WTO isn't really functional right now, I think we do need to have those conversations, and the CFS is one potential place. I saw the two questions on the economic shifts needed and are we going to move towards smaller scale local regional food systems is kind of connected, because I think the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on food security is really a wake-up call to move us towards more resilient food systems. And I think what that really needs to look like is some big shifts that in part lead us to think more about local and regional markets and trade, et cetera. And so what I'm thinking about here is when I say resilience, we need to be able to respond to crises like this in a way that doesn't break the food system, but rather the food system can respond and be nimble in the face of it. And what we've seen even in the last food crisis and since is that many countries still are food import dependent, and they rely often on just one or two countries as suppliers for some of their staple grains, and also a handful of very concentrated global agricultural grain trading companies that control much of the market. And a way to sort of build resilience, I would argue, is not necessarily to cut off all trade, but to really focus on improving domestic production capacity, but also domestic capacity for processing and for trading and marketing as well. And so I think we need denser networks of production, processing, trade, and storage capacity. And that would bring more resilience. And just to say, and how that links to the economic shifts, this kind of model is often criticized as being inefficient because storage is costly. It's costly to have this kind of redundancy in markets and et cetera. But I think this is the wake-up call that we need to start prioritizing resilience over efficiency in all cases. And in this instance, I think this is going to mean building stronger capacity at that local and regional level.
Thanks, Jennifer. David.
Yes, thanks. First, thanks for all these great questions from the participants, and I see they are very active, and it's great to see the global community reacting like this. So let me maybe start by this point regarding trade, WTO, and food security. And I will be very blunt in the sense that WTO has not been designed to deal with food security per se. Food security is, first of all, a question about inequalities. People may not accept it, but yes, economic inequalities is one of the main challenges of food security. And most of this have to deal not in an institution that is designed to do trade rules. There is internal political choices and international political choices about inequalities. And the WTO is here to give a framework where policy can be coordinated and to get a relatively fair, freer trading system. And I would say we are quite lucky to have the WTO because so far, even if the global food trading system has some problems, it managed to feed about 8 billion people. It avoids countries to enter in trade wars every 2 weeks. It has limited the fact that large countries like even the European Union were exporting their volatility to their neighbors, were dumping their goods on their neighbors. They have followed some disciplines. And maybe more important, because when we think about global food security, we have to think about, sometimes I'm a bit worried when I hear local, because we have one planet, we have one house. And we are lucky, for example, to have two hemispheres that can take planting decision and harvesting decision not at the right time. So if something bad happens in the US, people in Brazil can react. If something bad happens in France, people in South Africa can react. And we can use this incredible way to deal with risk because we have rules that allow Brazil to make investment, that allow South Africa to make investment, that make opportunity Tanzania to make investment tomorrow, to make sure they can provide what the need of the global population will need if something bad happens in the next country. Because there is always crisis. There is always environmental crisis, health crisis taking place in any food system. No food system is 100% resilient. So when something happens, you need help from someone, and you need that someone is ready to produce and export this food. So really, we need this global framework of cooperation. Some political choices, as I said about inequalities, may not take place at the WTO because that's not the forum, and there is other places to discuss it. And I think Jennifer has raised this question. And of course, we have a number of UN institutions that are here to deal with international cooperation. And now we have, when we talk about economic efficiency, yes, we have economic choices. We have a number of trade-offs to deal with. And the big one is what is the level of inequality we accept, what is the level of efficiency we accept, and what is the level of risk we are going to take. And we need to make sure that we are putting the cursor and the threshold on the three axes at what the population wants, at what and different populations have different preferences, so there's no one-size-fits-all mechanism. but this is why we need to keep in mind. And let's not forget environmental constraints that take place also at different scale. Of course, we have a global planet, it's a global climate, and what we do in terms of emission is important. But locally, you don't want people to overuse pesticides, to degrade soil because they will overuse them. So we need a resilient food system. We want a fair food system. We want to avoid concentration in terms of power along the value chain or across some countries or agents. But thinking that we can do everything everywhere doesn't make sense either. We don't want to be 100% resilient and use all the water we have over 20 or 30 years. If you're in the Middle East and you know that you, for the size of your population, you don't have the land resources and the water resources to feed them. So just let's make sure that we are making the right choices, weighting the different trade-offs, and that we try to get the discussion in the right place. I will just conclude by, what type of policy we need. And I think that so far we have seen this first wave of stimulus package that are first of all here to deal with social safety net, maintaining income to go. I think in 5 to 6 months, we will need a second layer of stimulus package to make sure we don't get stuck in the economic crisis, that people that are basically used their savings, that are used various coping strategy, can consume again, can participate to the economic activity again, so we don't get stuck in a crisis for several years. And then we will have to deal with the debt crisis, because we are all living on credit. If we are not working today, we are living on credit. And someone will have to pay for it, both in terms of public and private debt. And how the world is going to deal with the debt issue within countries and across countries will be fundamental about the future of the world in terms of inequalities across countries and within countries.
Okay, thanks, David. I'm going to take another round of questions, and then I'm going to try and see if we've improved the audio from Senegal for Dr. Barrow. So another round of questions. One was about the whole issue of land rights and land reforms, and whether we should be expecting a new wave of land grabs like we saw in the 2008-2009 food crisis, and what can be done if this is a possibility. We've got a question on women's role and why gender is not more central given women's vulnerability and their importance in the response. And then we have some comments back from people, I think disagreeing and agreeing with some of our panelists. So I encourage the panelists just to flick through some of the responses that we're getting from colleagues. We have, I see another one here. Jeff Tansey writes, which actors may benefit out of the crisis through scoping up lower valued assets and concentrating power further in a system where already there is a high level of concentration of power. Okay, just before I hand back to the panelists, a question from Fian on the regional responses to cope with food shortages, not just with health crises. So, Honourable Bazivamo, I may ask you to answer that question.
I wish to say that when it comes to regional responses, of course, there are things which can be done at regional level and others which are actually delegated, especially for implementation at national level. We take general measures to let countries go back and implement. But at West African community level, I would say it is very early to say that the pandemic will influence policies. Of course, we have got some, let's say, challenges, the issue of having all people home, the issue of closing almost everything, but it is still early to say that this will automatically change policies like land policies, like the issue of involving women in agriculture. Agriculture, women are already almost 80% involved in agriculture in East Africa. And this, I think, will not change. What will change is how to ensure we build maybe more ownership especially when it comes to funding agriculture and giving direct funding to women so that they can cater for the activities on the agriculture level. But in most cases, they are already involved, and I do not think this pandemic, we can say at this time around that it is already influencing what kind of policies to be taken. At this time around, it is still early, in my understanding and from what we have seen.
Thank you. Jennifer and David, I'd also like you to address some of these questions coming in about the future and what we should be expecting in your answers. And Jennifer, I'm not sure if you spoke about the question on institutions and what kind of institutions we need, but I don't know if you wanted to come back on some of the points that David was raising. So I hand over to you now. And sorry, Jennifer, before I hand over to you, I realize we're at time. As I mentioned in the introduction, we will go 15 minutes over to give the panelists some time to answer some more of the questions. But for those of you who do have to leave, thank you again for participating, for joining us. It's been a first conversation on the food security implications of COVID, and I hope it will not be the last. I've seen many more organizations organizing and hosting webinars, so hopefully we will meet again in future discussions. And those of you who can stay on, please do stay on because we will address a few more questions. Thanks, Jennifer.
Great, thanks, Karen, and thanks for these excellent questions. Just on the institutions issue, I mean, I did mention, I think that some of these discussions can and should be taking place at the Committee on World Food Security, in part because, I mean, the whole saga of trying to improve the agreement on agriculture over many years has really revealed that putting food security first as a priority over trade hasn't really gone all that well. So I think we do need to think about having a really frank and honest discussion, maybe in an institution outside of the WTO, about how we reconcile trade and food security issues. But that's a huge conversation for you know, future discussion. And I think that question on land rights and potential land grabs is a really interesting question. My own personal take on that is that I don't see that a new land rush happening anytime soon, partly because it's not like moving into agricultural production is going to be super profitable right now because commodity prices are falling, but also because it's very linked to the financial crisis. The financial investors right now are finding themselves wanting more liquid assets, partly because they have to pay off debts. They're seeing like heavily indebted, you know, and as even though interest rates are really low, I don't think there's going to be a big rush into land as an asset. So that'll be an interesting space to watch, though, to see how those dynamics play out. I also really appreciate the question on the women's role and the question of gender. I think women in particular are among some of the more vulnerable, especially with less formal employment, and also then with burdens within the home, and then people being home because of these confinement and restrictions. There's just a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of women right now, and many women are also facing questions of malnourishment and et cetera, because especially those who are already hungry. And so this is really important in a context where we're seeing a global pandemic, and I think that's something that definitely needs more attention. And just to say, I saw some questions. I've figured out how to open the chat and saw some questions about how we move towards more sustainable systems as part of a resilient food systems going forward. And I think just to circle back to my point about prioritizing other goals over efficiency, like if the public sentiment is on board with prioritizing resilience over efficiency, I think we're also able to then piggyback on that to prioritize sustainability, to prioritize equity, and to prioritize empowerment and agency within food systems. And I think those are all crucial elements to have this sort of sustainable, resilient, equitable, and empowering food systems. I think that's how we really need to reform things going forward to be able to cope and respond to these kinds of crises. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. David.
Yes, and to echo what Jennifer has just said, I think that part of this is at the core of the SDG agenda to some extent, that even before the crisis, we were trying to say, okay, we need to capture the economic, social, and environmental dynamics of the world and to try to get more policy cohesion within country and potentially across countries. And this crisis is maybe just a reminder, but also a call for action, because the way that we are going to exit the crisis, and once again, I think in terms of inequalities will be key, and the type of reform we are going to make or not to make is basically to be the source of the next crisis and the next problem we will face. I just want to go on the last point that I think has been is discussed a lot in the chat. On one hand, on technology, right now we are not talking so much about technology because the supply side is not really the issue, but of course we know that we have the climate crisis and a number of things where technology will play a role. I think that new technology can also help to smooth the supply line, but also the monitoring of problems in order to make sure that we have the right information at the right time to not act based on fears, but on data. But really my point is about when we say, okay, is the length of the value chain a problem? Right now, most of the problems come from short length. It's the fact that I cannot go to the grocery shop. I cannot go to the market. The small producer cannot pick up the vegetables at 20 kilometers of the city to deliver it to the market, either because he doesn't have access to the labor force or because the market is closed. The long value chain right now are not more risky at this and more disrupted at this time than the short one. When we have this kind of systematic lockdown of the economy, that's the situation. So, of course, some long value chain can be more risky in some situation, but this is not the situation right now. We have a lot of disruption taking place everywhere at the same time, causing local problem more than global problem. This is why all these reaction in terms of trade policy are quite inadequate, because the problem is not right now in the trading system. Actually, we have more facilities to move food around through shipment and boats at sea than with food in trucks within countries. So just to make sure that we have the right assessment of the situation to trigger the right response. I am not advocating in global long value chain, and most of the food we eat is still produced relatively locally, and regional markets matters. But it's not because we have this kind of global pandemic, then, oh, what is foreign is risky. I need to close my border. Long value chain are risky. No, we are dealing with social confinement in order to not get contaminated due to close relation. And the fact that it's my neighbor or someone that is coming 5,000 kilometers away, more or less the risk is the same nowadays.
I have one question that keeps coming back. Apologies, we've seen it now. So from Professor Vizosa asking about what institutions exist to allow collective action across regions. So Jennifer, I wonder if you want to maybe briefly answer that, and maybe also Honorable Bazivamo.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks for the question. I wasn't sure if that was a question about regional institutions or global institutions to allow for collective action. Maybe you could clarify.
I think it's a bit of both, because he's asked the question a few times. What are the existing enablers to allow a collective action across regions? So I think there's a regional and a global question there about the institutions that exist to allow us to have this collective action, whether it's regionally or globally.
Right, and I mean, it's a good question. It kind of comes back to one of the earlier questions about ensuring that responses are tailored to country contexts and regional contexts as well. I think the crisis really does help to shine a light on the fact that our current institutional structure might have some weaknesses. We already talked about some of the weaknesses of the WTO, for example, but even the G20. In the last food crisis, the G20 had a real you know, they had a difficult time, let's say, coming to consensus on some of the big issues that needed more immediate responses, in part because of the different regional differences among some of the biggest players in the global economy, having differences. So, you know, countries like that were big producers of biofuels, for example, didn't want to sign on to any kind of arrangements that would cooperate with respect to biofuels because they were making a lot of money out of it. And so those kinds of institutions do have some problems, even though they might represent the biggest economies and might be able to raise money for response efforts. They have difficulty because of those kinds of differences. So I do think there might be space for more regional institutional kinds of responses, but you know, within the UN system can have global cooperation. And again, not to keep coming back to the CFS, but I think it's a really important body because it is supposed to be the coordinator on policy responses with respect to food security. And perhaps there's, you know, some space there to think about more regional institutions that interface with that body to deal with these kind of specific ways in which these crises play out in different places.
Honorable Bazivamo, what's your view about collective action across regions or within regions and the institutions?
Thank you, Karine, and thank you, Bizoza, for the question. I found it very important. As I said it at the beginning, regional responses are actually very useful, especially when you are dealing with things which are of transboundary nature. And it is important to see these responses in a multi-stakeholders approach. When you discuss this matter on COVID and you think about agriculture, you cannot forget trade, you cannot forget infrastructure, and you cannot forget health, of course. And these different stakeholders to work together is very key. And then it becomes very important to link all regional authorities to work together, especially when you think, for instance, of this Food and Drugs Authority in the partner state. They have to be working together, and to be able to work together, they need a kind of coordination. People in the standards area who are working, actually controlling effort is brought in partner state is of quality. Regional bodies who coordinate these different entities to facilitate this free movement of goods are very key. And I think that we have witnessed that, where you see also when it comes to customs, when it comes to revenue authorities, it is important they are coordinated to work together so that the free movement, let's say, of people or of goods is facilitated. When you speak about port authorities, when you speak about airport, one country can decide to close, but there is a need, whichever case, of movement of goods or people from whichever other country to come in that country, being the nationals or people who want to take these people back home, who are strangled in this partner state. So to say, there is this, and when it comes, for instance, for training of authorities at airport level, at port levels, so that they can work together to find kind of common solutions to the common problem. It's important if this is coordinated at a regional level, and I find it is very important for regional institutions to be there and to be strengthened so that they can work together, complementing with national stakeholders, national institutions. As I have still the floor, Karin, let me say that in this framework, it is very important to think actually on how to increase, especially in developing countries, use of technology, digital agriculture solutions, because it has been seen, it is very important actually this time around to put more emphasis on how to mechanize agriculture, on how to use digital solutions in input trade and product trade, but also in extension services. These are solutions which are very useful to increase actually result and achievement in this agriculture and food security area. The other thing, and the last one, the issue of cities. We see actually cities which are growing at a rate which is very high. In our region, we see this is around 18%. And these cities are not growing at the same pace as agriculture is growing. And these people in the cities need to be fed in how do we move at the same rate as our cities when it comes to ensuring food security and nutrition in these cities. And here, when you think about smart agriculture, this is one area, but also smart cities, combining also the element of environment and agriculture, wherever you are, I think it will be very important. Thank you.
Thank you. I still see some questions coming in. I think I'm going to close now, but we will follow up with you and we will keep a record of all the questions and comments that came through. I would like to thank the panelists for your participation. Apologies to Dr. Burrow that we weren't able to connect you. And a huge thank you for your overwhelming presence and participation on this webinar. This is a first conversation and we need to have many more like this, not only about how we respond to the crisis today and the kinds of measures that are going to be needed to deal with the loss of income and the loss of access to food and to livelihoods today, but also this longer term challenge about when we come back to normal, what is the kind of public investments we're going to need to make in the food system to not return to the status quo, and to be able to better manage not only crises like this pandemic, but other crises, most particularly the climate crisis, but other future food, financial, climate crises. And so I think we need to be able to have both this response in the short term to help people deal with the most urgent needs right now, which I think has been the focus of today, but not forgetting that we don't want to return to the status quo. And we do need a different type of investment in our food system. Thank you everyone again. And I look forward to joining you in other webinars and other conversations in the coming weeks and months, and hopefully to seeing some people in person in the not too distant future. Thank you.